Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. There comes a moment when your silence stops being harmless and starts becoming suspicious. That moment is where this story begins, because lately you've been carrying yourself with the kind of quiet that makes people sit up straighter, lower their voices, and replay old conversations wondering if they said something wrong. Your sudden calm has turned into a psychological event, and the people around you can't decide whether to feel curious, nervous, or both. Usually both. It's funny how quickly human beings fill silence with fear. According to behavioral studies, when someone drastically reduces communication, others instinctively perceive them as more powerful, especially if that person was once expressive. And that's exactly what's happening around you. Your absence didn't create a void, it created tension. The kind of tension people feel when the room gets too still, and they realize they can finally hear their own heartbeat, and their regrets. What they don't understand is that your quiet season wasn't some dramatic exit. It was a long overdue recalibration. Life forced you to step back, and instead of explaining yourself to everyone like you used to, you chose to channel your energy into rebuilding. While they were still trying to decode your last sentence, you were busy rewriting your entire inner blueprint. The shift is unsettling for them because you're no longer predictable. You're no longer the person who responds instantly, laughs at everything, or entertains every little disturbance. Now you move with intention, with focus, with a certain "I'm not playing the old game anymore" vibe that nobody can quite articulate. They feel it before they understand it. And let's be honest, watching people scramble to interpret your calm has been oddly entertaining. They're acting like you vanished into the mountains to train with monks, when in reality, you probably just turned off your phone, minding your business, drinking water, and realizing peace tastes better than drama. But whether you planned it or not, your quietness has become a message in itself, not a cliché. Silence is loud, but a shift that exposed who misunderstood you, who underestimated you, and who now sees you in a completely different light. They're realizing you weren't being defeated. You were becoming someone they should have never provoked in the first place. Number 1. People thought your absence meant retreat, until they realized it was calculation. People often assume that when someone goes quiet, it's because they've been overwhelmed or pushed into a corner. That's the story they tell themselves because it keeps them comfortable. In your case, that assumption couldn't have been further from the truth. Your absence wasn't about weakness, it was about strategy. You stepped back not to hide, but to observe. You stopped showing up everywhere, not because you couldn't, but because you finally understood that your presence shouldn't be scattered. It should be intentional. While people were busy drawing their own conclusions, you were busy drawing new boundaries. You weren't retreating from life, you were reorganizing it. You pulled away from the noise long enough to see things clearly. The people draining your energy, the patterns slowing your growth, the habits that weren't serving you anymore. You made changes quietly, without the need for announcements or applause. That quietness became your strength. It protected your process. The unexpected twist is how threatened people felt by your silence. They thought you'd fallen off, only to realize you'd been sharpening your perspective. They thought they had time to underestimate you, only to discover you were upgrading behind closed doors. The moment they sensed the shift, the panic set in. Your calculated absence forced them to face a truth they never considered. You were preparing for a version of yourself that didn't rely on their validation, attention, or approval. Your calm confused them because it didn't fit the story they created in their heads. They expected reactions, explanations, or emotional outbursts. Instead, they got stillness. And stillness, in the hands of someone who's evolving, becomes unsettling. They realized your silence wasn't a pause, it was momentum. A kind of momentum they couldn't measure until it was already too late. Now your presence carries new weight because people know you didn't just disappear. You repositioned yourself. And nothing is more intimidating than someone who used their absence to become someone stronger than they were before. Number 2, you stopped explaining yourself, and that's when they noticed. They never understood you to begin with. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who never bothered to listen in the first place. For years you may have felt pressured to clarify every thought, defend every decision, or soften every truth so it could fit into someone else's comfort zone. And all that time, they wore their confusion like it was your fault. But the moment you stopped giving explanations, something shifted. Without your constant translations, they were forced to confront a reality they'd been dodging. They never actually understood you at all. When you stopped explaining yourself, it wasn't arrogance or coldness, it was honesty. You realized that understanding isn't something you can hand to someone like a wrapped gift. It either grows naturally or it never arrives. People can't claim they know you when their version of you has always been built on assumptions, convenience, and whatever image made their own life easier. Your silence became a mirror. Without the noise of explanations, they heard something they hadn't heard before, their own lack of effort, their own shortcuts, their own shallow reading of who you actually are. They suddenly saw how little time they'd invested, how often they misunderstood, and how quick they were to judge based on half-stories and guesswork. And because you stopped filling in the gaps, those gaps became impossible to ignore. The funniest part is how threatened they felt when they realized they were out of their depth. People like to pretend they have you figured out because it gives them a sense of control. But when they discover they've been guessing all along, it rattles them more than they'd ever admit. Your refusal to keep coaching them through your identity felt like betrayal to them, when in truth it was relief to you. So when you stopped explaining yourself, you did more than save your energy. You exposed the truth. You showed them that understanding isn't about how clearly you speak. It's about how willing they are to really hear. And that realization, more than anything you could have said, is what shook them. Number 3, you became harder to predict, and unpredictability is what makes people uneasy. People love predictability because it makes the world feel manageable. When they can read you like a book, they feel safe, in control, comfortable. But the moment you stop giving them those easy cues, that sense of control cracks. And what fills the space isn't curiosity, it's discomfort. When you became harder to predict, it wasn't some dramatic rebellion. It was simply growth. You changed, refined, matured, and stopped moving in patterns that once kept everyone else relaxed, even when they kept you trapped. Unpredictability isn't chaos, it's clarity. It's knowing yourself well enough to no longer perform for anyone's expectation. When you stopped reacting the way they expected, they felt exposed, as though the ground beneath their assumptions had turned soft. They didn't know how to behave around the new you because they were still holding on to the old script. They kept waiting for the same responses, the same jokes, the same apologies, the same emotional availability, and you weren't giving them that anymore. What they didn't realize is that unpredictability in someone who's evolving isn't about being mysterious for the sake of it. It's about having agency. It's about choosing carefully where to place your time, your words, your energy. When your actions stop being automatic and start being intentional, people interpret that as danger, even though it's really just self-respect wrapped in calm confidence. The tension they felt came from this simple truth. They can't manipulate what they can't map, and they can't control what they can't anticipate. When you became unpredictable, you became untouchable in the ways that used to cost you peace. They noticed it quickly, even if they couldn't articulate it. Their frustration wasn't about you changing, it was about losing the advantage they never admitted they were enjoying. And there's a certain quiet humor in watching people panic because they can't decode someone who never agreed to be decoded in the first place. Your unpredictability taught them something they weren't ready for. A person who knows their worth doesn't broadcast it in words. They prove it in choices. And that is always going to make people uneasy, because it reminds them of what they haven't yet learned for themselves. Number 4. Your quiet shift in priorities made their old influence useless. When you quietly started shifting your priorities, you probably didn't realize how dramatic the effect would be on the people around you. To you, it felt natural, like adjusting a lens until the picture finally came into focus. But to them, it felt like losing power without ever being told they had it. They were used to pulling strings you never meant to hand over. They were used to shaping your choices with guilt, boredom, pressure, or the simple weight of their expectations. And then one day, those tactics stopped working. Not because they became weaker, but because you became stronger in the places that mattered. When your priorities changed, you stopped outsourcing your peace. You stopped letting other people dictate what deserved your time, what deserved your attention, and what deserved your emotional energy. You started protecting space they once occupied without permission. And since influence only works when someone accepts it, their influence evaporated the moment you no longer did. The interesting part is how confused people get when their influence stops producing results. They search for new angles, new excuses, new emotional levers to pull. But the truth is simple. Once someone stops being emotionally available to manipulation, there is nothing left to grab onto. Your calm, your boundaries, your new direction, all of it created a kind of immunity they hadn't planned for. They might call it coldness. They might call it distance. They might even whisper that you've changed too much. What they're really reacting to is losing access to the version of you that bent too easily, cared too loudly, and carried responsibilities that weren't yours in the first place. And there's a quiet humor buried in their frustration. They act as though you owe them an explanation for becoming healthier, clearer, and more self-directed, as though growth should come with a warning label and a consent form they can sign before it happens. But growth isn't a committee decision. It's a personal revolution that often happens without speeches, without fanfare, without apology. Your quiet shift in priorities didn't just improve your life. It revealed exactly who was benefiting from your old habits and who had no place in the new ones. In the end, their influence became useless not because they lost skill, but because you finally learned power. Number 5. They realized too late that your absence upgraded you while their environment stayed the same. There's a harsh truth people rarely admit. Growth is lonely, and it's invisible until it's too obvious to ignore. While you stepped back, tuned out, and reorganized your life, they stayed right where they were. Same routines, same conversations, same excuses, same energy. They kept replaying yesterday while you were building tomorrow. And because growth doesn't come with fireworks, they didn't notice it until they felt it, like walking into a room and sensing something has changed, even though they can't name it. Your absence wasn't empty space. It was preparation. It was discipline disguised as silence. It was learning to think deeper, choose smarter, and care less about things that never served you. You weren't just away. You were upgrading yourself in ways no one could interrupt, no one could dilute, and no one could take credit for. When you came back, you didn't shout it, you didn't post it, you didn't explain it. You simply carried it, and people felt it before they understood it. The funny part is how offended they became by something that actually should have inspired them. Instead of asking how you changed or what you learned, they focused on how it made them feel. Small, left behind, exposed. Because when someone grows, it forces everyone around them to confront their own stagnation. And most people would rather blame the person growing than admit they stopped trying. You became sharper, calmer, more selective, more grounded. Your decisions started making sense even when they didn't come with commentary. Meanwhile, their environment stayed unchanged. Same problems, same habits, same emotional patterns looping like a broken record. And when they compared the two versions, who you were and who you've become, they felt the gap like a wound they didn't know was there. What they didn't realize is that upgrading yourself isn't about chasing perfection. It's about refusing to stay the same when staying the same has been costing you more than you can afford. Your absence became a mirror they didn't want to look into, because it showed them a version of themselves they hadn't bothered to meet yet. So when they finally recognized the difference, it wasn't jealousy or admiration that shook them. It was clarity. You used your time wisely, and they didn't. And that realization is always a little painful, especially when it comes too late. Number 6, you stopped reacting, and it forced them to face their own irrelevance. There's a powerful shift that happens when you stop reacting to everything that's thrown at you. Most people run on emotional fuel. They feed off chaos, conflict, and the satisfaction of pulling a response out of someone. When you stop giving them that, it's like turning off their favorite entertainment channel, and suddenly they're left sitting in a quiet room with nothing to watch but themselves. When you stopped reacting, you weren't being cold or distant. You were being deliberate. You realized that every reaction is a kind of permission, a little handshake that says, "Yes, this deserves space in my mind." And once you withdrew that permission, what they brought to you had nowhere to land. The drama missed its target. The guilt fell flat. The manipulation became invisible. In short, their whole toolkit stopped working, not because it was impressive, but because you stopped carrying it for them. The greatest effect of your stillness was not on you, it was on them. Without your reactions to validate their importance, they suddenly had to confront the awkward truth. They weren't as central to your life as they thought. That kind of realization can sting more than any argument, because it's internal. It's not about what you say, it's about what they finally hear inside their own head. It's funny how people mistake being needed for being relevant. They lean on the idea that if someone reacts, cares, gets upset, overthinks, or explains, then they matter. But when you stop giving those emotional servings, they're forced to admit that their relevance was built on your over-engagement, not on their actual value. Your calm became a kind of spotlight, not one that shone on you, but one that illuminated their habits, their insecurities, and their desire for attention disguised as concern. They felt uncomfortable because stillness reveals things noise can cover up forever. In the end, you didn't make them irrelevant. They revealed it on their own when the mirror finally turned their way. And that's the quiet power of not reacting. It doesn't punish anyone. It simply stops playing roles in dramas that were never meant to be yours. When you choose peace over reaction, you do more than protect yourself. You expose the truth everyone else was too busy acting to see. Number 7. You outgrew conversations that were never meant to grow you. There's a moment in anyone's life when certain conversations start to feel like walking in circles. At first, you don't notice it. You laugh, you talk, you participate, even when the words bounce off the same walls they've been bouncing off for years. But growth has a way of making you sensitive to stagnation. One day you realize you're not being inspired, challenged, or understood in those conversations anymore. You're just being tolerated, entertained, or drained. And that realization hits harder than any argument ever could. When you outgrew those conversations, it wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Some dialogues exist to build connection, clarity, vision. Others exist to fill time, repeat complaints, replay excuses, and keep people comfortable in mediocrity. When you stopped showing up for the second type, people didn't know how to take it. because they never saw those conversations as shortcuts to nowhere. They saw them as the whole road. Your growth made you hungry for depth, honesty, progress, and meaning. But those conversations couldn't feed that hunger. They offered noise when you needed insight. They offered familiarity when you needed expansion. They offered emotional loops when you needed closure. Instead of forcing yourself to swallow something that no longer nourished you, you quietly stepped away. The beautiful and slightly uncomfortable truth is this: when you grow, you expose who is willing to grow with you and who is content staying exactly where they are. They may call it distance, coldness, or sudden maturity. What it really is alignment. You stopped pouring your time into conversations that rewired you for stagnation and started choosing ones that rewired you for evolution. There's even a little humor in it, because once you stop engaging in those old loops, you can't help noticing how predictable they were. The same complaints, same theories, same excuses, same emotional drama, like a rerun no one asked for. Walking away from that feels less like leaving people and more like turning off a TV show you'd been watching out of habit. In the end, outgrowing those conversations wasn't about superiority. It was about honesty with yourself. You recognized what was holding you still, and you refused to sit in it any longer. And that kind of self-awareness is rare enough to scare people, but powerful enough to change everything. Number 8, you didn't become quiet. You just stopped entertaining noise. Silence gets misunderstood because people rarely look beneath it. They hear less and assume you have nothing to say, when in reality you have more to say than ever. You've just finally decided it deserves a better audience and a better moment. What changed wasn't your voice. What changed was your tolerance for noise, those meaningless comments, pointless arguments, recycled drama, and energy that leaves nothing behind except tiredness. When you stopped entertaining noise, it felt like stepping out of a crowded room into clean air. You didn't become antisocial, you became selective. You didn't withdraw, you defended your focus, because not every sound deserves your attention, and not every opinion deserves your emotional investment. Most people treat every little disturbance like it's a call to arms. You stopped doing that. You learned that peace isn't something you find, it's something you curate. The shift unnerved people because they were used to being heard, used to being engaged, used to having their noise reflected back to them as importance. When you stopped giving that back, they felt dismissed, even though you were simply choosing clarity over chaos. They thought you were shutting them out when you were actually shutting out the clutter. There's a kind of power in reducing what you respond to, because response shapes reality. When you respond to every irritation, every gossip, every half-formed opinion, you train the world to treat you like a bulletin board. When you stop, you teach the world to treat you like a decision. And the comedic part is how people suddenly panic when their noise stops working. They misread it as punishment when it's really just filtration. You didn't throw away connection, you threw away static. You didn't reject people, you rejected the parts of interaction that kept you smaller than you were meant to be. What they never realized is that quiet people aren't empty. Quiet people are purposeful. Quiet people are listening to their goals, to their instincts, to their growth. They're choosing where their energy goes because they finally understand it's their most precious currency. So no, you didn't become quiet. You became discerning. And that is always going to look like silence to people who have spent their whole lives shouting just to feel heard. Number 9, your stillness revealed their dependency on your chaos. There's a truth most people never admit. Some individuals don't actually want you to be okay. They want you to be reactive, emotional, unpredictable, or overwhelmed, because your chaos gives them a kind of comfort they can't get when you're balanced. When you finally found stillness, when you stopped feeding that emotional turbulence, it threw them off in ways they weren't prepared for. Your stillness wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with speeches or declarations. It came quietly, like turning down a volume knob everyone else thought was supposed to stay loud forever. And suddenly they were confronted with a version of you that didn't match the rhythm they'd grown addicted to. Without your fluctuations, their own instability became impossible to ignore. People who depend on chaos feel useful when someone else is spiraling. They get to play rescuer, advisor, critic, or moral authority. But when you stop spiraling, they lose their role. They lose relevance. They lose a script they've memorized so well they don't even know they're reading it. The moment you became steady, something in them wobbled. They didn't know how to talk to you without tension, how to connect without drama, how to feel significant without being needed in crisis. And that discomfort is telling. It shows that their attachment wasn't to you but to the emotional rhythm you were giving them. There's something almost poetic about that revelation. Your stillness didn't expose them because you pointed a finger. It exposed them because truth always rises when noise drops. When you no longer served as the storm in their day, they suddenly felt the quiet of their own unresolved issues, their own insecurity, their own hunger for relevance. Some will blame you for changing. Some will say you've become distant or cold or unrecognizable. But the real shift wasn't in you. It was in their dependency on a version of you that kept them feeling alive in unhealthy ways. In learning to calm yourself, you unintentionally taught them a lesson they weren't ready to hear. Peace is contagious, but it can also be inconvenient to people who have built their identity around disorder. Your stillness didn't break anything. It revealed what was already cracked. Number 10. You closed doors. They assumed they could walk through forever. There's something deeply unsettling to people when they discover that access is not entitlement. For years they walked through parts of your life as though you were a public hallway with no locks, no boundaries, no rules. They spoke into your decisions, dipped into your time, claimed emotional space, and acted as if it was their permanent right to do so. Then one day, you closed a door, not out of spite, not out of coldness, but out of clarity, and that single act shook them more than any argument ever could. Closing a door isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as no longer answering every call, no longer justifying every choice, no longer letting someone sit in spaces they never respected. To you, it feels like protecting yourself. To them, it feels like exile, because they never recognized the privilege they were enjoying. What they never understood is that boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They decide what comes in and what stays out. When you finally installed those filters, you weren't rejecting people. You were rejecting patterns of behavior that drained you, confused you, and slowly rewrote your sense of self. The reaction is always predictable. They get offended, defensive, dramatic. They act like you broke a social contract, when in truth you just corrected one that never should have existed. They thought access meant loyalty, familiarity meant permission, proximity meant ownership. But you taught them a lesson most people learn too late. Closeness is earned, respected, and maintained. It isn't automatically granted because someone happened to be around long enough. There's humor in their panic, too. They behave like you've suddenly changed the rules in a game they thought they were winning, when really they were just playing without realizing you were the one keeping score. When you closed those doors, you didn't shrink your world, you refined it. You made room for people who treat access as honor instead of convenience, and for spaces in your life that actually nurture you instead of slowly eroding you. The truth they felt but couldn't admit is this: they weren't losing you. They were losing the illusion that they could walk through you forever without ever being invited, and that realization is always louder than any door could ever shut. Number 11. They mistook your availability for simplicity, until you became selective. For a long time, people confuse availability with weakness, kindness with simplicity, and flexibility with stupidity. When you were always there, always replying, always helping, always smoothing things over, they didn't see strength in that. They saw convenience. They saw someone they could lean on without ever checking if you were tired, overwhelmed, or quietly carrying more than you should have. Then you became selective, and suddenly their comfortable narrative collapsed. Selectivity isn't selfishness, it's discernment. It's understanding that your time and peace are finite and that giving them away without thought is a form of self-sabotage. But when you started choosing who gets your attention, how much energy you spend, what conversations you enter, they felt betrayed, as though you'd broken some imaginary contract that never existed. The truth is, they weren't upset because you changed. They were upset because their life became a little less easy. When you stop being instantly available, people project meanings onto it: pride, distance, coldness, arrogance. They miss the real meaning entirely: self-respect. They never noticed how their demands slowly shaped your habits, how their comfort became your obligation, how their convenience became your pattern. Becoming selective forces people to confront something they never wanted to examine, that they no longer hold automatic rights to your time or emotional labor. They can't just walk into your day with requests, complaints, or expectations and walk out as if nothing happened, leaving you to carry the weight. It's almost amusing how disoriented people get when their usual access routes close. They act like you've suddenly turned into a maze, when in reality, you just finally drew a map and stopped letting everyone redraw it for you. The shift also reveals something deeper. People don't value what they get for free. When you start charging your presence with intention, suddenly it becomes precious in their eyes. Not because they've matured, but because they've finally been denied. You didn't become difficult. You became intelligent. You didn't withdraw. You refined. And that, more than anything, is what unsettles people, because they can't manipulate a version of you that knows exactly where it stands and refuses to be used as background noise in someone else's life. Number 12. Your lack of response forced them to deal with the consequences they tried to dump on you. For years, some people get used to the idea that you'll pick up whatever emotional mess they drop in your lap. They get comfortable tossing their guilt, their unfinished business, their irresponsibility, or their chaos in your direction because you've always caught it, carried it, or cleaned it up. Your response became their escape route. Your empathy became their safety net. Your patience became their permission to keep repeating the same mistakes. Then one day you stopped responding. Not in anger, not in silence meant to punish, just in clarity. You recognized that every time you reacted, explained, soothed, or absorbed, you were giving someone else a free pass to avoid their own growth. And when you removed that automatic support, something remarkable happened. They were left alone with their own consequences for the first time in a long time. People hate that feeling. It's uncomfortable. It's loud. It forces responsibility into the room like an uninvited guest they can't ignore. Without you to soften the impact or shoulder the load, their problems stopped being theoretical and started being personal. They couldn't blame you anymore because you weren't playing the game. The funniest part is how quickly they turn defensive when their shortcuts stop working. They call you cold, distant, unhelpful. They act like you've betrayed them, when in reality you finally stopped betraying yourself. They're not angry because you stopped responding. They're angry because they have to respond to their own life now. Your lack of response wasn't withdrawal, it was a reset button. It reminded them that actions have weight, choices have ripple effects, and emotional maturity cannot be outsourced. You aren't responsible for carrying what they refuse to acknowledge, and you aren't obligated to fix what they won't even attempt to understand. In that moment, you did something quietly powerful. You returned ownership. You handed back what was never yours to begin with. And when people are forced to face what they've been avoiding, it can feel like falling even when it's really just waking up. So they might resent the silence, misunderstand the stillness, or dramatize the distance. But deep down, they know the truth. You didn't abandon them. You stopped enabling them. And that is always harder to swallow than any argument you could have given. Number 13, your quiet era exposed. Who was watching you more than supporting you? When you drifted into that quiet season, you probably thought it would go unnoticed. After all, people rarely applaud silence. They cheer for noise, progress, announcements, and emotional availability. But silence has a strange power. It reveals. When you stopped showing up the way they expected, when you stopped feeding the daily updates, the reactions, the comfort, something unexpected happened. People suddenly became observers instead of participants. The ones who never supported you, never encouraged you, never invested in you, were the first to notice your absence. They turned into silent detectives, checking for signs, reading between lines, watching like they were tracking a story they never read. They weren't invested in your growth. They were invested in your presence. They didn't care about your well-being. They cared about how your behavior reflected on their own sense of relevance. It's almost dramatic how transparent people become when they're forced to sit without their usual access. They start commenting on things they never understood, judging choices they never tried to learn about, feeling entitled to opinions they never earned. And all of it exposes something deeper. They were never supporters. They were spectators. Meanwhile, the ones who truly cared didn't panic, didn't interrogate, didn't demand explanations. They respected the shift because they understood what it takes to grow privately. They knew silence isn't abandonment, it's incubation. When your quiet era revealed who was watching, it also revealed who was absent in the ways that matter. Some people can't cheer for you when you're moving, but they can't stop staring when you stop. Some people can't add to your life, but they can't stop monitoring it like it's entertainment. There's humor in it too. Watching someone pretend they're concerned when really they're just curious is like watching a bad actor forget their own lines. Their performance becomes painfully obvious the moment they don't get the applause they expected. In the end, your silence didn't hurt anyone. It clarified everything. It separated genuine support from passive fixation, loyalty from nosiness, love from boredom. And once you see that distinction clearly, you stop worrying about who is watching, because you finally understand who was never meant to be in the front row in the first place. Number 14. You no longer announce changes. You became the change. There's a powerful difference between talking about growth and living it, and most people never cross that gap. They make speeches to convince themselves. They post declarations hoping someone will hold them accountable. They announce plans as if saying them out loud is the same as doing them. But you stopped doing all that. You didn't announce a transformation. You didn't ask for applause. You didn't even ask for understanding. You simply became it. When you became the change, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Growth that matters rarely makes noise. It shows up in the choices you stop making, the habits you drop, the people you distance from, the discipline you build, and the peace you claim back. It shows up in how you carry yourself, how you think, how you respond, how you refuse to shrink to fit old expectations. People around you felt it before they could name it. They saw confidence without arrogance, calm without detachment, strength without aggression. And because it didn't come with the announcement or a warning, it scared them. They couldn't prepare for it. They couldn't negotiate it. They couldn't reduce it to something they understood, because it came from a place they've never visited. Internal conviction. When someone becomes the change, It forces everyone else to reflect, even if they pretend they're not looking. It reminds them that progress isn't a performance. It's a daily decision. It exposes how much time they've spent talking instead of building, dreaming instead of doing, wanting instead of becoming. There's even a little humor in how people react. They act surprised, like you've pulled off some magic trick, when in reality, you've just been consistent while they were busy narrating their own excuses. They want to know how you did it, as though you followed a secret recipe, when the truth is painfully simple. You showed up for yourself when no one else was watching. By becoming the change, you created something no announcement could ever create: credibility. Quiet, undeniable, unshakable credibility. And that is what truly rattles people. Because when change stops being a promise and starts being a person, it becomes impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to replicate without doing the same hard work. You didn't speak it, you lived it. In the end, what this whole journey reveals is something deeper than silence, deeper than change, deeper even than growth. It reveals truth. When you step back, when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining, when you stop entertaining noise, when you close doors, when you become selective, when you outgrow shallow conversations, when you refuse to carry what isn't yours, when your stillness exposes dependency, when your quiet reveals who truly cares, and when you stop announcing change and simply become it, the people around you are forced to confront something they've avoided for years: who you actually are versus who they thought you were. And that confrontation can be uncomfortable. It can be unsettling. It can even be a little frightening for those who built their comfort around the old version of you. But for you, it is liberation. It is clarity. It is power used wisely instead of wasted loudly. Growth doesn't always come with applause, and it doesn't always come with understanding. But it always comes with a new kind of peace, a peace that no one can take from you, no one can argue against, and no one can diminish because it is built from within. So if you've been too quiet lately, don't mistake their discomfort for your failure. Don't mistake their panic for your mistake. Don't mistake their confusion for your obligation. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who has learned to choose exactly when, how, and with whom to speak at all. If this video gave you clarity, strength, or even just a moment of aha, then do me a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, honest, mind-shifting content. Like the video if it resonated with you. Drop a comment and let me know which point hit you the hardest, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Your growth is noticed, even when it's quiet. Stay awakened, chosen ones.